This video is the ultimate guide that will help you ace the IGCSE Biology Paper 4 exam and make sure that you get the A star by the end of it. So without further ado, let's begin. Alright, tip number 1 is to know the exact types of questions that come up in paper 4. So in paper 4 there are 4 types of questions that mainly come up. The first one is the describe and explain graph questions. Second one is the explain the concept questions. So for instance, explain how xylem transports water up the stem of the plant. That's explain questions. You also have your labeling and explaining parts of a diagram, so the role of different parts of a diagram, for instance the diagram of a heart. And lastly, you have simple calculation questions like percentage changes. So if you were to break down every single type of question, let's start with a describe and explain type of question. So what this means, it has 2 sections to the question, right? Describe and explain. The describe section basically refers to picking out specific trends from the graph. So when you have a graph question given to you, make sure that you look at the trends of that graph. For instance, is the graph steeply increasing? If it is steeply increasing, from which point to which point is it increasing? Which point does the graph peak at or have its optimal value? This is usually seen in enzyme-based graphs, right? When you have a graph of enzyme activity versus temperature, for instance, you'll have a bell-shaped curve like this. So you need to look at the optimum point, the peak point, increasing point, and where it decreases as well. Make sure that you also include specific terms like steep decrease, gradual decrease, and where the label points, data points, where that decrease is occurring to and from. The explain component of this question would be explaining the concept, so going in depth about why something occurs. So whenever you think about explain questions, I want the question of why to pop up in your head. So when you have a question like, why does temperature affect enzyme activity? You can talk about denaturation of the enzyme, changes to the active site of the enzyme, conformational changes to the 3D structure of the enzyme, tertiary shape, things like that. Make sure to include keywords in the explain section of your answer. Calculation questions. Make sure that you guys are checking the values that you're inputting correctly. Often what happens is that you have the values in the question. When you input it into your calculator, you might miss a couple of values by a few decimal points, or you might read it wrong. So make sure that you actually read it right and correctly transfer it. Second thing is use your logic. What I mean by that is the fact that when you have an answer, for instance, if you get a negative value for transpiration rates, for instance, think again. Obviously not possible, right? You can't have negative values for transpiration rates in something that only can be positive. So that's one thing. Second thing is also make sure that the value seems somewhat right. Like if you have transpiration rates and you're getting 0.00003, that's not possible, right? Obviously not. So check your answer, use your logic, and make sure that at least in your gut you kind of know that okay, this matches what the question is asking, and so this is possible for an answer, like this is a possibility. Next thing is labeling the diagram questions. So what I recommend to learn diagrams is 1, draw them on your whiteboard. Make sure that you have a very clear, concise, and neatly labeled diagram on your whiteboard that you can look at every day, or paste it like what I've done behind. It's not necessarily a diagram, but you can do the same thing. You can draw a diagram on a white piece of paper and put it at the back. Make sure that you look at it every single day, maybe in your bathroom mirror if that's what helps you. Or you can also use something like this, like a transparent, I'm pretty sure you do get this in a lot of stationery stores. It's transparent or clear sticky notes. And what you do is you draw the diagram, so you mimic or you outline the diagram from your textbook and put it on your textbook. Every time you open your textbook, the front page should then have that diagram, and so you're kind of conditioned to looking at it. This will help you remember where the labels are for specific terms. Alright, with tip number 2, that problem where you have an answer, you write down the answer, but when you look at the mark scheme, and none of the keywords that you want or none of the words that are in your answer exactly match up with what the mark scheme or the examiner wants. Very common issue, right? The way to deal with that is actually to make sure that you're using keywords. Now, how do you get these keywords is probably the most common question. Instead of scrolling through 5 years, 10 years worth of past papers, which takes a hell lot of time, what I would do instead is to go to your specification, go to your syllabus, that orange document that you have on the Cambridge website, go to that and actually look at the dot points given. Most of the time, you know what's interesting? Most of the time, those dot points that are given is actually your description that the examiners want you to write. So for instance, to explain, amino acid to protein conversion, right? To explain protein synthesis, the specification has an exact dot point list of steps that you can memorize, and if you blot that out onto the exam paper, you will get full marks. The fact that I only realized this the last 2 weeks of my IGCSEs was actually insane, because this saved me when it came to making sure I was hitting every single dot point in the examiner's mark scheme and getting full marks for every single question. So tip number 3. Now I know that I preach a lot about memorization, but when I talk about memorization, I only talk about memorizing keywords in mark scheme answers, not necessarily memorizing concepts. You need to make sure that you understand concepts, and what I mean by that is actually using one concept, linking it to a different concept from a different topic in the IGCSE Bio syllabus. How I would recommend doing this is using mind maps. So I would do a lot of whiteboard mind maps for my concepts, and to make sure that I actually could explain what I was understanding. So all of the videos that you guys have seen of me when I first started out Biologue are actually when I was doing my IGCSE. So I would explain concepts that I was struggling with after I studied them multiple times, made sure that I was really familiar with it, and then I would explain them on YouTube. Right, so this is a really good way to make sure that you're understanding the concept. I think the crux to acing this exam is actually a combination of both understanding and memorizing. So I want you guys to know the overall ideas of each chapter, let's say transpiration, excretion, digestive system, things like that. I want you guys to know overall idea processes in those topics, and I also want you guys to have a list of keywords for each and every topic. For instance, digestive system, process of assimilation, I want you guys to know the definition. I want you guys to know keywords that you can use whenever a question asks you about how food travels through the digestive tract. Tip number 4 is about resources. So I get a lot of questions asking, where do I get my resources from? Do I look at the textbook? Do I look at online flashcards? Maybe online notes, Save My Exams, physics and maths tutor? I would actually recommend not doing any of those. What I would do instead is only make notes. When I say make notes, I do not use the textbook and blindly copy off the textbook or, make pretty headings and pretty headlines. So ones that you see on Instagram, Pinterest, these aesthetic looking notes, they actually don't help you study, to be very honest. So what I would do instead is just use those mark schemes and those syllabus guides, or you get online syllabus guides, sure, but I would make sure to use the specification for my course, for my IGCSE Biology CIE exam, for instance. I would use those two to make my keyword lists. My keyword lists were the only notes I used, and that was alongside the mind maps that I did on my whiteboard. And lastly, tip number 5 is about timed papers and self-reflection. These two things go hand in hand. I want you guys to really make sure that you're timing your exam paper. So whenever you do an exam, it's, regardless of whether you do it full through one go, you sit down, write the whole exam in one go. I would actually not recommend doing that because it tends to drain you out very easily. I would instead recommend timing every single section. So paper 4, for instance, I would do, let's say, the first 4 questions, which tend to be the more easier ones. Maybe it's like it imitates the multiple choice section where you just have to drag and drop certain options, right? So, or fill in the blanks, for instance. I would give myself less time to do those, so then I could quickly speed through that section, and then I could focus more on my long answer questions, which were 6 markers, 8 markers, things like that. When it comes to self-reflection, I talk a lot about the mistake sheet or the mistake booklet. You guys can check that out in a lot of my other videos. But what I also want to emphasize is reflecting on the number of marks that you have been getting for every single type of question, and making sure that you have that in an Excel sheet. So instead of making a whole, very detailed mistake book, which I'm pretty sure takes a lot of time, you can instead do a very simple Excel sheet after every single exam that you do. So you have the exam, what specific exam you have done. For instance, if you do 0610/42, put that at one section of the table. You also have the topics from which those questions that you're getting low marks on have been put. So what topics are you really struggling with? And then you also have For instance, 8 markers, if you're getting 4 on 8s, make sure that okay, I have 2 questions where I'm getting a 4 on 8, I have 3 questions where I'm getting 4 on 6, for instance, which is not bad. So have an idea of what questions you are really struggling with. So if you're struggling with extended response, focus more on that. If you are struggling with labeling diagrams, make sure that you are consistently drawing those diagrams on your whiteboard to kind of have a visual imagery in your head of them. That is it for this video, guys. I hope you liked it. If you did, do make sure to like, share and subscribe to Biologue, and let me know, as always, any of the video idea suggestions you guys have in the comment section down below. Do you guys want me to do any other subjects, any different papers, walkthroughs, things like that? Let me know down below. And as always, I wish you guys all the very best for your IGCSE exams. I'm sure you guys will do really well. And with that, I will see you guys in my next video. Have a great day.